zone, quite literally. No. Regardless, welcome everybody. This is the 7th meeting of our Collective Courage book study with Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard. Yay, we're getting right through it. We're almost done now. I think we have like 3 more left. So thanks everybody for being here, reading along with us. So if this is your first time at a Kepler Institute event, we're a nonprofit organization in Indianapolis, Indiana, dedicated to building community wealth through social enterprise, youth leadership development, and community discussions just like the one we find ourselves at right now. And you can always go to Kepler.org if you'd like to learn more about us. It's also thanks to community members like yourselves that we are able to keep events like these free and accessible to the public. So definitely be sure to go to Kepler.org/donate to contribute to our efforts. We take anything from $1 to $1 million if you got it. We would also like to thank the Indianapolis Recorder newspaper, the premier source of Indianapolis's African-American voices, aimed to empower and educate for over 125 years, for hosting this event. Thank you so much. But yeah, as always, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, a political columnist specializing in the solidarity economy, community economics, Black political economy, and popular economic literacy. Her research and publications explore the African-American community through the lens of cooperative economic development, worker ownership, wealth inequality, and community-based asset building and approaches to justice. Her magnum opus, and the book we'll be delving into further tonight, Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, takes an in-depth look into the socialized approaches of our predecessors, and we're here tonight to see how we can apply those same approaches today. So yeah, without further ado, Dr. Gordon Nembhard.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I have a little PowerPoint today. I'm going to do like 2 slides of introduction, then I'm going to leave it to our reflectors, and then I'll come back to my PowerPoint to give some other of my own highlights of chapter 6. Today's chapter 6, the 1930s and the Great Depression. Let me see if I can share my screen. I also always want to start with acknowledging the original stewards of the land wherever we are, reminding us that we are still on occupied territory in colonial status, even though we pretend that we're not. And I also want to bring our ancestors in and remember them, those who've toiled without just compensation, those who continue to struggle against anti-Black racism. I want to acknowledge the Black Lives Matter movement, who I think we've talked about sometimes. And I also, I guess I should tell you happy holidays, but actually Thanksgiving is not my favorite holiday. I actually think it should be a day of mourning and reflection about hypocrisy. So you all can ask me about that later, but I just wanted to, so wish you happy days off with your family. But I can't really say happy Thanksgiving because I don't think that's something we should be proud of the way the US has handled it. So quickly, I just wanted to situate us. After I wrote the book, I noticed that the 1880s, 1930s, and 40s, and 1960s and 70s were actually the 3 most prolific periods for Black co-ops. And so we went through the 1880s already, which I also told you a couple of weeks ago was a similar time to now in terms of return to very repressive anti-Blackness conditions. The 1930s, which we'll talk about tonight, are not so much an anti-Blackness period, though of course institutional racism was still at its height, but more about the depression and survival needs. In the 60s and 70s, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, are the economy wasn't so bad in those periods, but we had very strong Black power movement and Black organizations that were also pushing for economic liberation and using cooperatives there. So just to remind us of those connections, so all 3 periods, especially the 1880s and the 1960s, were strong racial consciousness and transitional periods of time. The 1880s and the 1930s were both survival and economic issues. And then all 3 periods had this Black organizations that were focused on economic liberation and deliberate co-op development. And that's, hopefully you've seen that. We started last time talking about Young Negroes Cooperative League, which came up in the 30s during the Great Depression. Now we're going to focus on all the other variety of co-ops that I found, but I wanted, again, to situate you where we came from, talking about one strong Black organization that was dedicated to liberation and using co-op development for liberation. And then you'll see actually Ella Jo Baker from the Young Negroes Cooperative League claims that a lot of the co-ops that we talk about in the 1930s that I found, she claims a lot of them were started because of the co-op education the Young Negroes Cooperative League did. And so just quickly, what happens in depressions like the Great Depression, right? Severe economic downturn, skyrocketing unemployment, disinvestment, loss of wealth, right? All that is double and triple for African Americans. And we see that co-ops were used to actually provide those needed goods and services, to do the reinvesting, right? Have communities reinvest in themselves instead of waiting for outsiders to come back and reinvest. Addressing unemployment and poverty issues, replacing investment, right, where others have disinvested. So addressing all these different needs by using a variety of co-ops and having a variety of strategies for why co-ops matter. So let's have our participants give us their impressions of what was happening in chapter 6 and during the Great Depression, and then I can go back and tell you about some of the other highlights for me for that chapter. So what was it? Youth went over beauty or something?
Well, you know, J-Roo is also very beautiful, so.
Thank you. I was going to say, I know you did not just throw that little bit of shade at me. I am the prettiest girl in this whole Zoom meeting. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to start anything. I didn't mean to start.
No worries. It's okay. We'll duke it out at a different one, but I'm going to let J-Roo go first since he's younger.
Okay, so thank you, Aguila. I appreciate that. But yeah, so I think the first part of the chapter that I rather enjoyed, or that I just wanted to touch upon, was that during like my own personal study of the African American community, especially like before I was really inducted into the Kepler space and really started to form my own understanding, I found that this particular time period, like the 1930s, like the early 1900s, give or take 30 years, that most American texts, or like most like educational texts, so I'm thinking like middle school, high school, never touched upon what people, especially in the Black community, were doing to provide for themselves during the Great Depression. A lot of the times I felt like the narrative was they just kind of made it through, you know, they worked really hard for scraps, and then, you know, the survivors made it out alive, and, you know, they continued on, the economy got better eventually. But you don't hear much about the cooperative era, or how cooperative economics was used to, like you said, provide a lot of the needs that these communities needed to live and be successful. And I think that's an unfortunate thing, because it removes, honestly, a very great example of cooperation and resilience that was necessary to overcome that harsh race and class stratification that was happening during that time period. And something else that really, I guess something that I identified with heavily during this time period, or during this chapter, is that the different cooperative enterprises were so ready to affiliate with one another. So one of the facets of capitalism that always really bothers me is how we're trained from inception to compete with one another rather than cooperate and combine our efforts. So even something simple like the, I'm trying to remember what the exact name of it was, hold on. The Harlem Consumers Cooperative, them working out of the basement of the New York Urban League, I thought showed a commitment to the ideological perspective that we should share our resources, you know, And I think that that's something that's important moving forward, because there's a lot of organizations that I'm connected to and that I'm working with, Kepper included, that I think are doing a lot of great things and they're doing a lot of good work. And having those organizations come together and kind of consolidate their efforts under a single banner, as some of the cooperatives during the chapter did, that's something that I would have liked to see, that I'd like to see more of now. I think that'd be a great way to alleviate some of the market failures that capitalism shows. You know, I mean, nonprofits are already operating to eliminate a lot of those market failures, and obviously there's some differences between nonprofits and uh, collective, uh, sorry, cooperatives. That's the word I was looking for. There's some differences between nonprofits and cooperatives, but at the end of the day, they're still trying to push the mission. You know, they're still trying to achieve a goal, and like I said, alleviate some of those market failures. And then the last thing I'll touch upon is I really liked how Ella Jo Baker hammers in the necessity for patience when it comes to the development of cooperatives. Because I know if anybody in attendance is anything like me, I'm a very impatient person, and maybe it's just a part of my youth, but I really enjoy instant gratification. You know, these damn phones. Uh, but I enjoyed hearing about how these organizations needed to take their time and develop the not only the financial capital and the financial investment necessary, but also really hammering in the educational aspect of it. So like the Consumer Cooperative Trading Company, they held weekly educational meetings for like 18 months or something like that, over a year, before any businesses got put into motion. And I think that's a really important piece of it. Another important piece was, again, that capital investment, because they talked about how a lot of the high mortality rate of a lot of these cooperatives came from the fact that people just didn't have the financial infrastructure or the financial foundation to keep these cooperatives in business. Like, they just weren't making the profit necessary. They weren't able to keep it going, until you look at some cooperatives like the Modern Co-op, which had members who had a more stable income, so they were able to fare a little bit better. So just touching on that class solidarity, again, consolidating the efforts of multiple groups in order to see the best possible outcomes. So yeah, that was my take for the most part.
Nice, great, thanks. That's I had some of that in my summing up PowerPoint slide too. So I think let's just go with Aguila, and then we can all dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of pick up where Jeru left off. He did a good job with the summary. And I would say some of the reflections and themes that I saw as relates to this one period of time, and then kind of more of a real deeper look at the different cooperatives, which are all over the nation, from New York to Kansas City, which is always great for me to hear, because like oftentimes when people talk about these models, and even to this day, you know, the association is like these cooperatives exists on the coast. It's very much like a coastal liberal elite kind of concept. But the examples in like Gary and Kansas City and Virginia, and then I know later on, especially in the South during the 60s, are real great examples of like, you know, this is something that people have done all the time. So that was really great to see again in this section. And just like some themes that I saw in terms of like what helped some of these cooperatives or didn't help, was like this question of capital. And we're still grappling with that to this day, of like, how do this, like, cooperatives get access to capital to start their businesses. And, you know, and financial capital is very critical and is very important. But, you know, some of what we're trying to do also is like, how do we look at creating the infrastructure and being able to address the needs, with money is important, but then also what are some skills and talents and gifts that others can contribute to build that up. And I just thought that experience with that Harlem Cooperative, where they were in a dispute around labor and the labor union, was really interesting because the worker cooperative model is also another way to kind of address the issues of capitalism and fair wages. So I thought that was really interesting, and how even within cooperatives that tension still exists of like labor versus the consumer, and how do you manage that. Um, and especially during that time, it's like thinking of like the larger context in the 20s, there was a rise and fight for workers' rights and like the labor movement, and like how a lot of actually like Black and brown workers were involved in that. So I thought it was just really interesting to see that reflected there. Um, Again, the importance of education, which we talked about in chapter 5, and making sure that continual education can happens, and that awareness is just as important to like getting a co-op started. And I think in the beginning of the chapter we talked about the different like journals and essentially media that was highlighting and we're able to access more people about like here are some options and like alternatives, which really it reiterates the importance of like providing models for people to show to like that there is an alternative to what the system is. um so education. I think another really important piece was also the importance of like being locally like rooted, but also very connected. So like the different networks of relationships with like the churches and the business league and there was the Colored Merchants Association. How not just the relationships and ability to reach a large amount of people, but also the ability to buy collectively and like reduce prices, and the things about like these organizations. Like it was CMA that was talking about like pooling these businesses together to buy wholesale from suppliers, which I thought was like a really interesting model and something we could look at. Which also is kind of like the logic behind the buying club, but just at a larger scale and through the lens of supply. And then the other theme I thought was really important, that the most successful co-ops were the ones that like started out small, which I think kind of addresses some of that capital concerns, because what people did were they were able to start using what they had small, and then were able to build off of that to then get to a level of enough like financial capital to then start a larger co-op. So I thought that was a good lesson. And some larger questions that maybe we could talk about is, as I was thinking, um, what is relevant, through the lens of like what are lessons that we can take from this that's relevant to today. And in your first slide you had talked about like the 1880s, the 1930s and 1960s as like these like really kind of years of like massive or like more cooperative economic development, and how each um, era had like its own kind of unique larger like forces, whether it was like political. The 1930s were mainly out of necessity, like you had said, and like looking to today, we've got the precipice of like a global pandemic and the fallout with the economy. We've got a lot of political awakening with the Black Lives Matter movement, and just like we're seeing the repercussions, particularly of like neoliberal policies, which I don't know if it was really um, like that was not, I don't think, as like a major factor in the different eras, because neoliberalism was like a lot more, it like accelerated within the past like 20, 30 years. So like with this moment, how do cooperatives play a role in response to that? Like, rising fascism. The other piece that was really interesting for me was, I don't know if I remember reading this, but this is also in the context like towards the end of the 30s and early 40s, the context of like not the Green New Deal, but the New Deal, which actually excluded a lot of Black workers and people, and even driving the necessity for then Black people, because the rest of the country was being bailed out. But the Black workers weren't, and communities weren't getting that kind of influx of capital and resources and grants. They did get some, like you had mentioned, but they not as much. And we're also seeing that within the stimulus package, both in '08 and now, and how there's not as much of support for these communities. So it makes it even more relevant, like that piece around necessity and pooling our resources together, because it's important to agitate and push power to pay what they owe, but also at the same time, you have to build your own institutions, because that the government won't do that. So I'll end it there. Oh, and one more thing was the piece around just the mixed income. I think it was the housing cooperative, where it was mostly stable income, those middle class folks, and just this concept now, you hear it a lot in economic development of mixed income housing, mixed income, communities, and actually how that's actually really important, and applying it to cooperative economics because of how how wealth is distributed within this country. Those with more can invest more in terms of capital, but to help subsidize those with lower incomes or lower capital or access to capital. And just thinking about how does that look like today, and incorporating that into the models that we build. So I know with CCFI, that's something that was built in, was those who had access to more it initially started out with income, and then through some tweaks and stuff, basically everybody pays $20 unless you're a senior citizen or you're in SNAP EBT, and that helps subsidize that lower cost in terms and also donations and stuff. So I thought that was also really interesting. That was pointed out. It's a good lesson. Stop there.
Thank you so much. I don't think I forgot to say give a hand to Jayru too. I'm sorry. So let's give both a hand. Who wants to jump in? Comments, questions to our presenters? Any other themes? They pulled out a bunch of themes about capital, agency, networking, politics and economic climate.
I'll just say, it's so exciting to read this history that I didn't know about before. And I loved reading about Gary. Loved reading about the cooperative grocer and Gary. That was so cool. And as you were talking about, where you found these things in this file in the Ella Baker folders, I was like, wow, you must have been a detective on a thriller chase, piecing together, well, they didn't say the name, but based on the date and the operations, I'm pretty sure that these people were talking to these people, and New York City was doing this, and Philadelphia was doing that at this time. It was just so cool. And I was like, I can only imagine what it felt like for you to be the person going through and discovering these things. And then, just the work that you put in to make sure that this history was shared with people, when it wasn't before. I mean, it's amazing to me. And it even though it's the summation of the facts of the journey might to some seem like, okay, this happened and that happened, but it's like a thriller because you were rediscovering history. So I just love that.
Thanks. Thanks for saying it that way. Actually, when I reread the chapter, I had forgotten about some of those details. So I got excited too, but then I got embarrassed because a lot of the times when I speak, I don't even talk about some of those groups. But that chapter actually, right, the 1930s was the first time I had a variety of co-ops and a variety of sources about each co-op, right? I don't know if anybody noticed it, but pretty much in the other chapters, I had one source for this, one source for that. Every now and then I could match a couple of partial sources, But this time, a lot of the co-ops, I had an article here, something from Ella Jo Baker there, somebody else there. And so I actually, as you said, was literally, right, I found out this piece from that account and this piece from that account. And if I put it together, maybe I could tell you about a 2-year history. And so, yeah, I'd actually sort of forgotten about those kinds of details in some of those organizations. So it was fun for me to read it. And, you know, I do tell people that I like detective shows, not so much because of all the violence, but because of, right, that journey of piecing things together. I hadn't thought about it until you said it, that I was my own detective in a certain way. But I do like sort of the ability to pull the pieces together from varying sources, and then the fact that you end up with some answer at the end, right? That's one of the things I really like about the detective shows. At least that one stupid problem is solved, no matter, how horrible it was, or no matter how bad the murder was. At least by the time you finish the show or the book, it's done, it's over with, the pieces all meet, and you can move on, right? And so much of life is not like that.
Yes, and like the interconnections that you discover through that bring it to life. And I think also speak to some of what you've talked about a few times, as far as if this business lasted for a few years and then the business ended, some people would consider that a failure, but that's not accurate, because those people go on to do other things, and this informed that, and it's alive, and it's, that's still with us today now. Those pieces continue to affect things. So the interconnections give it life, and I just love the way that you pieced it together.
Thanks so much. Who else?
I guess I'll jump in and I'll say what I find amazing is the intentionality of the communities and the people. I wonder, when I'm reading through this today, would a group of people be willing to come together and say, we're going to study for 18 months to 2 years before we even do something, and then continue and do that. So to me, there was a lot of intentionality about, developing our intellectual skills. But also, I think, which you didn't touch on it, and maybe she didn't touch on it, but I think also what is also taking place there is relationship building trust, getting to know each other, and then having a sense of, kind of how we can move together. So I think, that was part of it too. But then also I thought about like what Agila said about the mixed income and that kind of stuff. And given, when there are time periods, and it seemed like she said, if they started small and they built from it, but the ones that seem to have individuals that had more steady income, they did better. And so in the context of that, what does that mean today if we're really trying to address the circumstances that the poorest of us find ourselves in our community? How do we create co-ops that will be sustainable and that serve both the poorest but have like that mixed income in it?
Yeah, I've been struggling since I wrote the book. I've been struggling with how to talk about that mixed income stuff. I think I might write it a little bit differently if I was going to write it over. Though believe me, I have no interest in really writing it over. But the reason why I say that is because I don't think I was wrong to say that in the analysis, especially in the 30s, right, in the Great Depression, the places that were able to have some people with a steady income who had some money to put in from the beginning, and who had money to buy the products of the co-op or whatever. I think that's still a huge issue. But the more I've learned about worker co-ops, and then you'll see the more we get out of the urban, because the 30s, this chapter is also more urban co-ops. I think chapter 8, I go into the rural co-ops in the 30s and 40s. The rural co-ops do manage with very little, partly, I guess, because they do have land ownership in some way. And so they are, a lot of it is about production of food. And so in that sense, even with little, what we call disposable income or whatever, they can do stuff. But the other thing I've been learning, especially like with worker co-ops, is even when you're able to pay in installments, the trick is not so much whether each member is middle class or has a stable income, but whether the co-op, how the co-op can leverage the pooled resources, even if it's a small amount of pooled resources. So some of the small credit unions show how you can do this. Some of the small ag co-ops and craft co-ops show how you can do this. So again, there is a way, and hopefully, as I said, some other chapters show it. There is a way that we can still see that co-ops, even though, right, capital is really important and it can make and break you, there are also ways that you can create some stability by pooling meager resources and leveraging them in certain ways. And so I think now I would talk about the ability to leverage is what's really important. And there again, I think, unfortunately, right, the people and remember, the Black middle class we're not talking about upper middle class. We're talking about postal workers and, people with a steady job, but not necessarily making a whole lot of money. I think that the point is they had steady jobs, right? And they had enough money to buy the product the co-op was making. But as I said, my new perspective on if you can figure out how to leverage and then attract whether it's municipal money or other capital because of what you're able to leverage, that seems to be what really matters. And I think that's where they're starting small and getting bigger, because that's what you're doing when you start small. You're pooling those meager resources, making them work for what you have, and then figuring out how to leverage them to either attract more capital, attract more people, be more income generating, right? And in the end, and I don't think I had that language before, the income, right, being income and wealth generating is what really makes you more solid and stable. And so how do we intentionally do that when we start or when we're in a co-op? I don't know if that makes any sense to people. But that's sort of where I've been thinking about that. But we also, we still do see it. I mean, some of the worker co-ops that are doing the best in the US are co-ops where the scale brings in a lot of money, but also our largest worker co-op is a low-skilled home care co-op, right? So they were definitely able to figure out how to leverage the initial capital, get other donations and stuff, and make a really viable business based on quality rather than quantity of money that the members bring, but the quality of the skills and the service that they either develop as part of the co-op or that they bring to the co-op. So it's a lot of interesting nuances, I think, that we start to learn when we focus on these things and try to understand what it really means. So thanks for bringing that up, Pambana.
Yeah, and I'll add on to Pambana's question or thoughts on relationship building, particularly like one of the things I noticed throughout all the examples in the chapter were the really like a strong foundation because people were already in a church together or a housewives club or living together in a community. So it made me ask like the question about like with like the breakdown of social institutions across the board, not just in the Black community, but just across the board. How do we navigate and how does that impact how we recreate a foundation of relationships and trust to be able to do things like cooperative development? Is relationship building first, or does it happen? Do those things go together and support each other? So those are some of my questions about like, how is it different now in the current social landscape?
Yeah, another great question and observation. I'm also going to see if anyone else wants to answer, but let me just tell you what I was thinking as you were talking. I think it's both. One of the things, and I think everybody's been saying it, the long periods of learning together definitely create solidarity and trust. So learning the craft of cooperative economics, learning the craft of the business you're trying to open as a cooperative, doing all that together, being in study groups together, I think it forges a bonding and a friendship and a way of knowing and working together and stuff that's indispensable. However, it's absolutely true that, I don't know, I was going to say 80%, maybe it's not that much, 70% of the co-ops that I found out about pretty much were started by people who either knew each other or were in similar circumstances. And so were familiar with each other's circumstances if they didn't actually know each other, right? But you're absolutely right. Even the mutual aid societies, right? Most of them started from a religious orientation or a fraternal organization or a block association. So it does help, because that trust and camaraderie is so important. It does help to start with it, but it's not impossible to create it. And I've also seen, again, the worker co-op movement that I study in the present, I've seen worker co-ops that actually have just put advertisements out for worker owners. And then it's in the training. Again, they do such an intensive orientation and training program that by the time they open the store, everybody has been working together, learning together. And so they have built that bonding and trust because it was built into the training. And I think I mentioned there's a co-op, Isuzu, in Atlanta that was doing high stakes stuff because they were trying to help all their members gain enough money for a $30,000 or $40,000 down payment on a house. And so they actually have, they built in an annual 3-day African trust building program to make sure that they kept those strong bonds together with the group that they had. And I don't know, maybe I didn't tell you guys this, but anyway, that's not in the book. One of my students actually did the research on that. And one of the things she found was that, I guess this happened during the last recession, right? The group was having troubles keeping everybody together because people were starting to lose their jobs, and they had you were supposed to put in $500 a month so that within a year or two, each cohort could have the 30,000 or so money that they needed. And one couple both lost their jobs in the same month and came to the next meeting saying, we have to drop out. We're so sorry, but there's no way we can put in $1,000, let alone $500. And the rest of the group said, no, you're not dropping out. We've come this far together, whatever. They started referring, they said, okay, what skills do you have? What kind of consulting can you do? And they started sending their friends to refer to them. They ended up being able to make the money that they had lost in their jobs by doing consulting because all the co-op members had recommended them to other people. And so they were able to stay in the co-op and continue to make their payments and make enough money until they eventually got jobs again. So that kind of camaraderie. And I'm not sure those people knew each other before they were in the co-op. I forgot to ask about that. But so that kind of camaraderie, I think, can be built and can be developed. But again, it's that deliberateness. Who is it? I think Pambala, right? Weren't you the one, or was it Agala, who talked about the deliberateness, right? That people were really focused on making sure they did it as right as possible, learning as much as they could from other people's examples, and being very purposeful and deliberate. And that also, I think, makes a huge difference. It's not something you go into lightly. It's not something you just kind of half-ass, excuse my language. But we're in it. We're in it for real. We're in it for the long term. We're in it because we believe in this, and this is how we want to behave with other people, right? So making sure, right, however that means, if it means learning together until everybody agrees with that stance, or whether it's that you find people who already agree with that, right? All those things, I think, matter. What does anyone else want to talk about that or raise another issue that they saw?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great story.
I am curious, and I forgot to bring this up, if you had seen anything around the connection of the Harlem Renaissance and arts movement, in arts and cultural movement in Harlem in the 20s and early 30s, and their connection to the large amount of cooperatives in that development.
It's a fabulous question, and I honestly have no idea. Now you're going to make me think about that. I know that, some of the artist groups were kind of artist collectives in some way. I think some of the housing co-ops house some of the artists and writers from, right? So there's that, but I don't honestly, I haven't made the connection. I didn't see anybody making the connection between the actual, what would you call that sense of agency and empowerment on the cultural side and how that might have connected to the economic side. But it's actually, you know, hey, some of you are grad students, right? It's a great graduate thesis. You know, I actually started, my undergraduate degree is actually in literature and African American studies. So literature has a special place in my heart. And I've often said that I want to teach a course about how novels and short stories about community building help to teach us and help us to understand and to feel that sense of what it means to really build a town or build the community, whatever, and that we can see it better through novels and short stories about it than we can just sort of telling how it's done or whatever. And so I was always thinking of doing a course where I went through the same sort of community development theories and strategies that I always do, but we illustrated everything with these examples from Black novels and short stories. So I do think there is something about culture and cultural sensitivity that also help people to have a sense of camaraderie and agency, right? Because that's the other thing that keeps coming up in everything you guys said is how important to notice the agency. That's back to the deliberateness too, the sense of agency that people had that, yes, we're going to do something. It doesn't matter how horrible the times are, right? And if you look at some of the examples, right, some of these co-ops are starting in 31, 32, 36, when there was nothing, right? People didn't have jobs, there was nothing. And yet they said, we're gonna do this. And when you look at the money that got raised, right? I don't know if you guys realize, I put in a lot of the money in those things because that's the 1930s. So, you know, $300 a month or $600 a year. Most people weren't even making that as income, but these co-ops are actually bringing in that kind of money, clearing money, paying back dividends, right? The Gary Group turned out, you know, in a year, they were the largest Black grocery store in the country. I forget some of the other stores. And the one Red Circle in Richmond, right? Competing with the white grocery store across the street and basically putting the white grocery store out of business, right? I mean, this is serious stuff in the middle of the Depression. So even though, again, nobody had any real money, even the middle class people barely had money, right? But they're still able because they care, because they're because they're consolidating, because they have a plan. And, you know, they're able to actually compete and win in these cases. And so I think that's sort of the other piece, and maybe, you know, a better sense of self because of the Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance in the 20s. Maybe that did help. You know, maybe I also don't know why there were so many co-ops in New York City, except that, right, that's where Ella Baker was. And she says it was the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And maybe she's right, but it also might be that that's just what she knew about. And so that's what she wrote about. But remember, I did get a lot of collaboration from some other articles about those same co-ops. So it's not clear whether New York really had so much activity and nobody else did, or whether it was just easier to see it in New York because of the people who were measuring it, or what. But it is interesting. I think you're right that by the time you get to the Great Depression, you still have strong sense of collectivity, solidarity, and examples of co-ops. The only other thing I could say, and this isn't really about the Renaissance or culture, but I guess we talked about a couple chapters back, the Mercantile Cooperative Association, also in Virginia, but in rural Virginia in 1901, that lasted about 25 years. The researcher the one article I had on that co-op said that because of that 25-year history of cooperation and economic stability that the cooperative society helped to create, right? They had more Black home ownership, They had more Black economic stability in the county. And by the time you got to the 40s, even though the co-op had closed by then, you still had a culture of solidarity that helped that county fight for voting rights and other civil rights. And so he says, you can't understand the advocacy they had in the 40s without understanding the impact of that 25-year history of being part of a co-op society, and then owning your own land because the co-op helped to give access to land ownership and that kind of thing. So sometimes we can, and I suspect if we were able to do more of those kind of long-term, deep case study, right, we would find more of that relationship, right? Both the solidarity, camaraderie, cultural as well as economic seems to create much more sense of power, stability, but also sense of power and accomplishment. I don't know, anybody else have some ideas about that?
I don't think I have an idea.
You have a
about
quiet
that, but when
group.
you were talking, it made me think about, like in there, some interesting things were that when they got started, they would just pick maybe one or two things. I think sometimes, when people think about starting things, they feel like, you have to have a variety of things. But I think one started with milk, one started with meat, and they built on that. So to me, I feel like, that's a powerful lesson to pay attention to too, that, you don't have to always start out with a variety of things, but if you can find something that people need, maybe one or two items, you can start there and then build on it.
I can see it now. Kepper's Bacon Cooperative. It'll go over real well.
What are you going to do with your vegans, though?
Vegan bacon.
Bacon, right?
Yes, the bacon is vegan in the sense that the pigs did not eat meat.
But that's a great point, Pambana. And that's, I think, what also makes everything seem more doable, right? I think it's really daunting to think about, either a whole grocery store or a huge mill or something, right? But to see it as, well, we just need this, so let's do this. We can do that. We can do it well. And then once you do it well and you have a little surplus, then you can see, oh, we could do it this way. We could do that, right? And so often, just getting a small victory does so much, even just for the group mentality, right? That you see you can work together, you can make something work. I actually have, I wrote an article, in 1999 or 2000 or something, about how I was I had heard about a group that helped people to put up a playground in their neighborhood. And they went through this whole strategy they used to get people together who wanted the playground, then break everybody up into groups, a fundraising group, a design group, a build group, and all the subcommittees do their piece, right? The fundraisers find the money to buy all the materials. The design group designs what kind they want. The build group gets people together who can actually build it once they have the materials. Then they have a build weekend where they build the whole thing over a weekend. They have another group that does all what happens that weekend, the childcare, the food, whatever. By the time they're finished, they have a beautiful playground that they can see that they built, but they also have this whole infrastructure that they built without even thinking about it because they were focused on the playground, right? But meanwhile, they had identified, they have a skills bank now. They know who's good at what, right? Who can cook, who does childcare, who can build, who can use a hammer, who can design, who can fundraise, right? They often end up with more money. The fundraising can be so successful that they have more money than they needed. So then they have a pot of money and an infrastructure of people who can do stuff. Well, that's a perfect scenario for what we call, a small victory, the playground, but then that could lead to more things. Once you do that, then they're like, okay, what else? What could we tackle next, right? And you already know, you've started working together, the strengths and weaknesses, whatever, you can move on to actually doing a business together or some other group project. So there's lots of ways to think about developing the camaraderie, the skills, and the practices that can become something more and more and more over time, instead of thinking you just have to jump into it, right, and open the grocery store next week or whatever, and have a big showcase, right? There's lots of other ways you can do it that might be more solid in the end. Okay, you want me to go back to my PowerPoint? I was going to highlight some of the co-ops and issues. There's a lot of quiet people out there. Nobody else wants to say anything?
We're missing Kenneth.
Sure, I know. Well, not that I'll be able to speak as thoughtfully as Kenneth on this. Sorry, this is Deidre. Let me put on my video. I'm trying to multitask, fix dinner,
It's all right.
do all the other stuff. But one of the things that struck me first was, why don't I know about this? I consider myself I'm not a historian, but like a amateur, historian. I've read a lot of, history books. And this is just beside, I've even read the biography of Ella Baker, and it doesn't really go into because I'm a huge fan of hers, but it doesn't really go into this history. So first I was like, why don't I know this? And second, it really, I'm like, wow, Black folks, we complain now, about, but working with a lot less and under a lot more difficult circumstances, it's just like excuse my 90s rapper language, we can't be faded. They just like, with everything, people living in box cars and in tents and, during the Depression, it was, the sense of resilience and more importantly, at the end of the day, how we came, not all Black people came together, but how people, not just in their family groups or in their church groups, but in their community groups, they recognize that we will starve if we don't come together and be creative, resilient. And so that's just one of the things that struck me. It's just the wealth of information that you were able to bring into this book. Why don't I know this? And two, like, everybody should know this, because I think it has such lessons for today. We have no excuse. We really have no excuse.
See, I think you bring up an interesting point, though, Deidre, is that during that time, it really was collaborate or die. And while it might still be like that now, I think it's like that now a lot more subtly, because people are not, well, I can't say people are not like very unemployed, because they are right now. But people are, blaming it on COVID. There's a lot of other factors that people will blame their success upon now that I don't think they would have before. And I think people see, like going to get a job, at Walmart or McDonald's or wherever, as a sustainable option, whereas like they don't need a cooperative to survive. Maybe they would like one to thrive, but they don't need. There are other avenues in which they can use through capitalism to survive. So they don't feel the same incentive to come together and work together to produce that.
Or is it, part of it become that, during this, especially in the 50s with the Red Scare and this, anything that reeked of communism was bad and evil and must be rooted out, that some of those messages even, resonated with people in the Black community, where they saw, maybe in the 50s or so forth, with the post-war economic expansion, started moving away from co-ops because they started buying into more of this kind of capitalist vision and thinking that co-ops are somehow communist and bad. Or Dr. Nembhard, did you see that, maybe once African Americans started to get a toehold in jobs that were once, off limits to Black people, whether it's in corporate America or in, medicine or universities in the late 60s, early 70s, that people saw less of an incentive, as you were saying, to rely on each other and look at co-ops and more trying to pursue a capitalist dream.
Yeah, I would add to that same point, Deidre, assimilation and integration and the deceptions of those ideas often have led to us moving away from the things that work. Okay, and again, it always ends up the same way. When shit hits the fan, we return to the things that we know work. And let's not leave out schools. That back when we ran control our own schools, and often at that time controlled our own curriculums, our abilities to make sure that our education was not as miseducated, that some of this just brought on ironically by some of the success of being able to have access and our failure to maintain our cultural integrity. I think we talked about it, if not last time, the time before that, with the fight Du Bois had with the crisis at NAACP about what are we trying to do here. So it's a philosophical piece too about what is the best answer and choices for people of color.
But I think that there is at least I this would want to hear this from the young people in particular. You know, when I graduated from college 30 years ago, you know, frankly, you know, it was, you know, you take your degree and you go get a job in corporate America, and you might work for the state government. I'm an engineer by first degree, so you might go and work at the State Department of Transportation, but that was like a least desirable option. You know, the desirable option was to take that engineering degree and work for a Fortune 500 company and see how fast and far you can go with that.
We told them.
Huh?
That's what we told our young people to do.
Yeah. I mean, and so
go into corporate America, make a whole lot of money. But very few people in our community would say, "Oh, you go in there and get those skills. You bring those skills back and build your own community." So we failed.
Failed. So I'm just saying. So 30 years ago, that was the message, and to do something different. You know, you really were charting your own path. My friends just thought I was weird that I wanted to move to Africa and do what I do. They just were like, "That Deidre, she's weird." But I think it seems, and the young folks, you tell me, that, you know, those who are coming, you know, out, you know, in their 20s or, you know, or even early 30s now, that there's much more of a social infrastructure around, you know, not necessarily pursuing that Fortune 500 company route, and being able to use whatever skills or education you've acquired to do more community building, social enterprise, so forth. Like the word social enterprise just wasn't in anybody's lexicon, at least that I knew of, you know, early 90s, early mid 90s, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, where I was inhabiting, you know, and working. Any thoughts from the young people in terms of, do you think now it's more acceptable?
People speak. I got one other comment. Corporate America is contracting. So you're not just for Black folks, for white folks too. So the idea of going into corporate America and climbing the corporate ladder, that's the fantasy.
Yeah.
I'm done. Young people. Hey, I only did that. Paula made me come in and speak.
So I've already said my 3 comments for me and for Kenneth. So I'll be quiet after this.
Well, we appreciate your service, Deidre.
Yes. Aguila, Mimi.
Yeah.
Alvin.
Well, you know, maybe I can speak for the other young people, but we're very strange. That I'm gonna let you know. You're asking. You know that. The data is a little biased. But I would say maybe one of the things for me personally, because I'm also an immigrant, and so the and coming from like the quote unquote global South, there was a narrative fed to me about the US as like a prosperous place. You know, you want to, particularly like through education, get to a good paying job, be able to support your family, and the US is the place of opportunities for that. And I think maybe we're the generation that got to see that lie very firsthand. And for me personally, seeing like, you know, my dad's a scientist and he was in academia for a while, but really like once he got to corporate, like, you know, he's a darker skinned Indian man, and it was very clear to me, just like, I mean, not that I was going into corporate America anyways, even as a child. I think my parents came to that conclusion. but I think our generation really got to see the repercussions and the actual realities of what corporate America really was. And then I think I grew up in, and I think my generation too also saw the collapse of the economy in 2008, right? And I think that also probably affected our psyche. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's like a generational thing, if it's just like we're seeing access to information, ability to look at other it's easier for us to access other narratives than maybe previously before. But I'll say in terms of like education system, like we weren't learning this. A lot of it you had to either come through other folks or oftentimes like through the internet. And the narrative about like Occupy. I would say also for me, like, coming to the US, I came right before 9/11. And then just like a lot of these narratives about the US were very quickly like brought down. And so that I think that questioning of like the system was already kind of pretty clear. And, like the Bush administration and the war in Iraq and 2008 financial collapse.
Great. So
J-Rue,
yeah,
I was just going to ask J-Rue. I just wanted to also, maybe ask J-Rue what his thoughts were on this.
yeah, sure.
Oh yeah. I would say that I don't know. I might be a little bit biased because my peers are in this space, a lot of the time in SPIA. But even within SPIA, there is definitely still a model of going up the corporate ladder, this time more in nonprofits than for-profits. There's still this idea of going up the corporate ladder, kind of being that figurehead or that primary capital owner, and then just going on about your business. There doesn't really seem to be a large collective spirit, and a lot of the time it's it's the for-profit mindset, just kind of transitioned into a mission statement rather than the direct monetary benefit. But in general, though, I tend to agree with Aguila, is that most of our generation is, just because of the information that we have access to and the communities, the narratives, the people who are, sharing their stories a lot of the time, that we have more access and just more of an understanding of the ways that corporations and big businesses exploit people. And also, I think a lot of people in my generation are, I say lazy, but they just don't want to be tossed around. They don't want to have to work 40-hour weeks at multiple jobs just to provide for themselves. And I think they recognize that it doesn't have to be that way, and they want to see it changing, especially now. We're right in the middle of a pandemic that's been handled terribly. So a lot of that, the romanticism around corporations and their benefit is kind of being torn down as we're seeing those same markets fail.
I would also add to that, I think that right now, in addition to everything that y'all have said, is, that turning away from corporations, whether it be a result of, movements like Occupy or just different kind of, I don't know, people, being able to access information about what's going on in other places and seeing just how poorly we're, what kind of straits that we're in this country, and then being well, is this the best way? Because it seems like people aren't doing it this way everywhere, and it's to different results. But I think that now it's definitely shifting. I don't know if it's so much about collectivism. I think a lot of the shift has moved to nonprofits are like opening your own business, like, okay, well, what, like, I swear, like, my dad is always pushing on me now. He's like, well, just find a thing and just start a business. And I'm like, no. But I think that that's like this thing that people see, like, it's not necessarily like move up the corporate ladder, because like M said, you know, the corporate sector is definitely like shrinking. And that contraction has pushed out so many people that it's like, you know, people are trying to figure out what else to do, but it's still like, well, it's capitalism. So if I just like have a new thing and know how to market that new thing and have enough people to buy that new thing, I'm good. Or it's like, well, I'll start a business, or I'll have an LLC, or so I think that there is like a shift towards like away from corporate, but also it's still a very individualistic kind of thing. But there's still like folks who are doing things collectively and collaborating, and definitely you see a resurgence within the past. Well, I mean, people have been doing this, but I think just like more broadly, excuse me, with like supporting like Black business, or just businesses that aren't usually pushed to the forefront, and like supporting local and stuff like that. So I think that there's definitely that those things are definitely becoming more, you know, apparent and pushed to the forefront, but there's definitely still the individual kind of like mentality that like that's still strong too.
People still want to get rich, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll throw in here too. I mean, I agree with everybody said. I think, you know, access to information and some of the visibility of events in our lives to draw attention to some of the problematic elements, insane elements of our society. I would add in climate change as one of those pieces. But I'll also say that I think that, you know, this generation of young people has probably had the most access to instantly satisfying desires with the least amount of work. Mm-hmm. And the most entertainment time. And even the concept of work is something that has become a colonized, corporatized thing in our heads a lot of times. And, you know, a lot of people's dreams still remain around having a lot of time for leisure, and an aversion to work as something that's inherently exploitative and something that I want to avoid. I think that, like, as I was reading too, I was also thinking, like, you know, there was one of the groups you're talking about, they held like 8 conferences in 1 year about this cooperative thing they were pulling together, and just the dedication and the work that these people put in to make these things happen. And I do think that with the conveniences, the instant gratification, like Jay Ruth spoke to before, of our generation, has impacted how we even, like, our attitude towards work, our capacity. And I don't know, I would just say, like, our generation is probably one of the most lazy generations. So I think that there's a lot of times there's consciousness that's present, but are people really willing to change their lifestyle and go after, some larger vision that they want to bring into the world and what it would mean to undertake to bring that into being, I feel like that's a minority of people. But I think possibly that's been true throughout many generations, is that's a minority of people. And I don't think that you need a lot of invested people to make change and to have impact. So
And
that's
I would
side for me.
I think that's an excellent point, and I agree that people are averse to work, but I also would say that it's because the models of work that we have right now aren't suitable for people's happiness. Like you say, oh, people don't want to work, but like I said, I don't think people want to work 40 hours a week, barely surviving, and it's just not fulfilling work. Uh, and because I think like people in my generation have watched their parents work hard for nothing, and they don't want to end up like that right now. So I think, as we've had in previous conversations, that it's about creating models that show that the work that we do can be fulfilling and can bring about the outcomes that we want to see. Because I don't think our current models of work are really doing that.
I agree with both of those, definitely. Like, we definitely don't, like, we are adverse to work, but it's because, yeah, like, it's like, well, past generations worked their ass off, and the distribution of wealth is still what it is. so, so yeah, it's like, well, that didn't necessarily work. So let's and I feel like, you see stuff like, I forget, there's like some book where it's talking about, I don't remember, but it's basically like a lot of people are like, there's not like because of, modern technologies and stuff like that, when it comes to a lot of the things that we kind of associate with just like, like that we've come to a place or at least people have predicted that we should be working less. Like, we shouldn't necessarily have to be putting in as many hours for as much. But I think that that's usually also probably in terms of like products and like tangible things. But like what Pabana was saying, like with the 18-month like study group, or like, it's not always, there's definitely different types of work and results. So like, if you're looking to create a tangible, little tchotchke thing, then yeah, you're not gonna have to put in as much. But for relationship building and community building, then that's not necessarily the same thing, but it's also a lot more fulfilling, as you said. So
Yeah, I think that's working for what, working how, when you're working towards your vision, your community vision of creating the world that you would like to live in, and fulfilling this purpose that we have, then there's ways that, even though it's hard work, it's different from the work that you do for someone else, for their vision, so they can get rich off your back. And so I just agree, like, that piece about fulfillment and what's the approach to work, how do you work, why do you work, that's key.
Yeah, and we're just more and more alienated from our communities, the fruits of our work, seeing how, because just not to be a Marxist on Maine, but he talks about the alienation of the worker from their labor. And as where we're at right now, we're seeing that further and further away. J. Rue's really excited. And you know that
I'm just laughing at Marxists on Maine. I'm stealing that so bad.
sorry. But you know, we're not, because I think even though we're, I think, collectively exhausted, and you know, I feel like the thing about like young people are lazy, it's like I feel like that's just like a generational thing where I think it's always like, you know, the younger generation will always be seen as lazy, and I feel like there's a little bit more to that. But that like, you know, post like pandemic and post disasters, people will come around and put in the effort to support their community and be able to see that the work that they're doing actually results in something that benefits others just for the sake of supporting their community. So we've been seeing an increase in mutual aid organizations and people just like with little money and little resources just going out there and feeding folks, giving food drives, things like that, providing resources to folks, especially in the like COVID pandemic. You know, we're seeing a lot of nonprofit, like grassroots organizations pivoted to be able to figure out like how do we support our community at this time. And it's really important because it's like how, and you know, oftentimes I think the narrative is so disempowering that like you don't have the agency, you don't have the power, you don't have the enough capital to start whatever. And that's why, like, you know, it's so important equally, like as we're talking about building models, like you can tangibly demonstrate like with what you have and the relationships you have, you can make impact. And that you can directly see like the work that you put in has direct impact on community and, you know, contributes. And that's missing, I think, a lot from our generation is our ability to be like, what am I doing that's actually like fulfilling?
I think that's a great segue into Dr. Gordon Nembhard talking about, you know, the next couple of slides, but then also how do you bring people together that are like-minded, you know, particularly young people, and get them excited about something where they'll see the fruits of their labor and they can contribute to a larger whole.
Thank you. I was about to say you guys don't need me anymore. You're doing great.
See, this is why we stay quiet, because as soon as we stop being quiet.
I know, then, right. It's actually 7:30, so I don't know how much longer we want to go. I actually, I don't have all the answers. You can see, you know, there's a variety of ways of getting young people involved. Sometimes, and I think we talk about it more in chapter 10 or something, getting young people to realize or to decide that they want to solve some community problems, and then finding that a co-op model will help them to do that, right? So toxic soil busters who were looking at lead poisoning in the soil in their backyards, Food from the Hood in LA, raising, you know, doing school gardens, and then using the money to help the homeless, and then using more of the money for scholarships for their members to go on to college. So there's lots of ways that you can think about, right, getting people aware of a problem, and then as they talk about it, get other people who are also interested in addressing that problem, coming on a solidarity, cooperative economic model that, oh, if we do it this way, right, we can afford to start small and to start slow and steady, but we can still address that problem and get a thriving business that we own collectively that will help ourselves and our communities, that kind of thing. So I think often that's sort of what I say is the kind of way to get in. It's interesting that, you know, throughout history, even those middle class co-ops that we saw, a lot of the the motivation there was really about either they still realized, even with middle class salaries, that they were excluded from things. They couldn't get the kind of products they wanted, or they had to buy stuff at a store that wouldn't hire Black employees, and they didn't want to do that, right? So there were still ways, you know, or if you take the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, they were like, okay, we got middle class wages because our union got us good wages, but what's happening with our money, right? We're spending it in white places. It's going out of our communities. It's not helping, right? So the fact that we have good, steady wages isn't even helping our communities unless we do something more deliberate with our wages. So they start doing co-ops. Yeah.
If I can just add something, this may seem completely tangential, but I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, Dr. Gordon Nembhard. That kind of thing didn't even, when I was a kid, kind of, register, because at least especially growing up in Detroit in the 70s, you walk into a store, everybody's Black. But I remember my grandmother, who grew up in Louisiana, this is like the 20s and 30s, where she was telling me a story about how one time her grandmother went into a store, it's a white store, like white butcher, and they gave her the meat, but she like knew the butcher, and they're like, oh no, don't give her that meat, give her the good meat. And I just remember, I kind of didn't understand
Not
the story.
Meat that most Black people get, right? Yeah,
right. And so she was like, oh no, that they gave her the meat that other white people, but like I remember, I don't know, maybe I was 12 or 13. I'm like, you mean there was different meat? Like the idea of going into a Kroger, maybe it does happen, I don't know, but like going into a Kroger at that time in a white person getting a better cut of meats than I get, it blew my mind that was that. Right. She was like, oh yeah, that happened all the time.
And it still happens if you think about it in terms of
same money, right, bringing the same money.
But fresh produce in a very low income neighborhood in a city, right? You don't get the fresh produce that the richer neighborhood gets, right? That's why some of these co-ops are started, because you can't even get access to those kinds of foods in your neighborhood.
Or with the same, even with the same chain store, when I lived in Kansas City back in the mid 90s, I bought my first house in an inner city neighborhood, beautiful old houses. It was inner city neighborhood. The grocery store that served us, it was a chain grocery store. You would walk in and you could smell meat when you walked in.
Meat, they got the oldest meat, they got the dregs.
Oh my! I was appalled. Right. And at one time, I wound up moving to Ghana like a couple months later. But I remember telling my mom, I'm like, I want to, so I would drive to the store in the white neighborhood, because you would walk in that store and it was, but I remember telling my mom one time, I was like, I want to take all of my money and I want to rent a bus and I want to put the bus in front of the grocery store and tell people, don't go in.
Everybody can get access,
get on this bus and we'll take you to another grocery store. And actually some of the preachers like had boycotted at one time, same chain, but it was just appalling that in 1995, they thought they could get away with
the same practices,
dirty floor, and like dull kind of dirty floor tiles. Just it was.
Yeah, they don't put the same money. They don't invest the same money. They don't, And so that's right. For centuries, that's one of the main reasons why people have been starting these co-ops. Even if they already had money or had access in some ways, there still wasn't access in other ways. And so I think that's part of, the story too, about how do we attract people now, right? Sometimes people didn't want to be involved in a co-op because they felt it was just as marginal as being marginal in the capitalist system, right? But mostly it was about, we're already marginal no matter what we do. How can we actually gain more control, do something better, do something for ourselves and our communities, and make, if we have some money, make it actually work better for all of us. And if we don't have some money,